Judge Silas Tillinghast was the face of law in Beaufort, a towering man whose word could damn or deliver a life. His sons were raised under his cold doctrine, obedience, supremacy, control. They were men who laughed at pain and practiced cruelty like inheritance. In the judge's estate, built on enslaved labor and Southern pride, fear was not punishment. It was order. The disappearance began on a Sunday night. The Tillinghast sons had gone riding after a church gathering. Drunk on bourbon and vanity, they chased a runaway slave down toward the marshes. They never returned. The judge's dogs followed their scent to the swamp's edge, then stopped, whining. There were no bodies, no footprints, only the faint reek of iron and the low hum of cicadas, as though the land itself were keeping a secret. By sunrise, the judge had sealed his gates. The sheriff was ordered to say nothing. The newspapers were paid to write about a family illness. But whispers spread through the town, of mutilated livestock, of screams in the cane fields, of something moving beneath the floorboards of the courthouse, and among the enslaved, a name began to surface again. A name the judge had buried years before. They called him Ansel, the one the judge had punished beyond human endurance, the one whose screams had echoed across the gallows yard in 1843. And now, they said, Ansel had come back. The Tillinghast family, the courts, the church, each would claim ignorance. But Beaufort had always known some wounds don't stay buried. They rot and they rise. In 1843, 5 years before the disappearances, the Tillinghast plantation was a kingdom of cruelty masquerading as civility. Judge Silas ruled it like a courtroom. His word was scripture, his punishments divine. Beneath the moss-draped oaks, beneath the bell tower where the slaves were summoned, there stood a wooden post streaked with dried blood. It was called the Law Tree. Ansel had once been the judge's favorite, strong, literate, obedient to the point of silence. He was taught to read scripture aloud for the judge's guests, forced to recite sermons about humility while his own body bore the scars of obedience. But when the judge's wife Eleanor began showing kindness toward him, a forbidden softness in her eyes, the household changed. The judge found a note once, folded inside a hymnal. A line from Song of Solomon in a hand that was not his own. That night the law tree saw fire. Ansel was dragged before the judge's sons, beaten until his spine bent, and sentenced publicly for insubordination of spirit. But it wasn't the beating that broke him. It was what came after. Silas ordered a punishment meant to erase his manhood, to make him a lesson of humiliation. The field hands said the judge's laughter echoed across the rice fields while Ansel's screams turned into something no one could describe. When dawn came, Ansel was gone, vanished. Some said he'd been taken downriver, sold to another plantation. Others whispered that he crawled into the marsh to die. But in the months that followed, strange things began to happen at the judge's estate. Horses found mutilated, chickens laid eggs filled with blackened yolk. The judge's youngest son awoke one night claiming to see a man with no shadow standing at his bed. The church called it superstition. The judge called it vengeance from God. But the old women in the slave quarters knew what it was. A spirit uncut, unbroken and unburied. And when the judge's sons disappeared in 1848, every slave on that land knew whose hands had finally come back from the river. 3 days after the Tillinghast sons vanished, the law tree, the symbol of the judge's power, was found burning in the night. No one saw who lit the fire, but every window in Beaufort glowed red as its flames licked through the fog like tongues of judgment. The sheriff and his deputies stood helpless. The fire hissed as if alive, spitting sparks that carried the stench of hair and oil. Some swore they heard screaming, not from the townsfolk but from within the wood itself, as if the tree's roots remembered every lash, every cry, every dying breath it had witnessed. By morning, all that remained was a pile of white ash and a single branding iron driven upright in the soil. The iron bore the judge's initials, ST. It was still hot. The judge didn't speak that day. He stood at his window staring toward the fields where fog rolled over the earth like smoke from a battlefield. His wife had taken ill. Her hair streaked white overnight, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. The servants whispered that she'd begun humming the same tune Ansel once sang while mending fences. The townsfolk wanted to call in the church, but the Reverend refused. "There are sins," he said, "that even God turns away from." Then late that night, the judge's eldest son's horse returned to the stables. Its saddle was empty, but tied to the reins was a strip of flesh, pale, human, and carved with a cross that bled fresh. The judge fainted on the spot. The next morning, the courthouse bell rang 3 times before sunrise. Not for trial, not for sermon, but for silence. Every door in Beaufort stayed shut. The air stank of river mud and iron. And when the blacksmith came to deliver his report, he said the branding iron found in the ashes wasn't forged by his hand, or by any man he knew. Something else had made it. Something old, something the law tree had been feeding. The judge's mansion had gone silent. No laughter, no music, not even the clatter of servants' feet. The house that once roared with law and gospel now breathed like a grave. But in the upper chambers, behind a locked door, Eleanor Tillinghast had begun to hum again. Her hymnal sat open on the vanity, its pages warped by candle wax and something darker. Between the verses of "Abide with me," faint writing could be seen in a trembling hand. A confession disguised as prayer. He made a covenant not with God but with man, and man's cruelty became his altar. She had written these words sometime after Ansel's punishment, and below them in a different ink a symbol, 2 interlocked circles with a downward cross, a mark older than the church. Eleanor had always been delicate, but after the sons disappeared, her fragility turned prophetic. She spoke of hearing footsteps beneath the floorboards, voices in the walls calling names no one had spoken in years. The judge forbade anyone to enter her room, but the servants said she spent her nights whispering into the mirror, asking forgiveness from the one without light. One night, a maid named Ruth defied the judge's order and brought Eleanor her supper. When she opened the door, she found the room filled with hymnal pages nailed to the walls. On each page, the same line was scrawled in blood: "The river remembers." Eleanor sat in her chair, clutching a small object wrapped in linen. It was a man's tooth, not old, not decayed, fresh. When Ruth ran screaming from the room, the judge struck her mute with a pistol whip and locked the chamber. By dawn, Eleanor was gone. The window stood open, the hymnal torn apart, and footprints led from the balcony toward the marsh. In the mud below, they found a single note pressed into the earth. It was written in the same trembling hand as the hymnal: "He comes at night wearing my husband's voice." That was the night the judge ordered the marshes drained. He claimed it was for farming, but Beaufort knew what he was trying to bury. When Judge Tillinghast ordered the marsh drained, Beaufort trembled. The marshlands were sacred to no one and feared by everyone, black, white, free, enslaved. They said the mud there was older than the river itself, that it swallowed anything that bled. But the judge's decree was final. He hired 50 men armed with spades, shovels, and silence. For 3 weeks they dug canals through the black earth, rerouting the swamp's water into the sea. The air grew sour, thick with the smell of rot and iron. Men coughed blood and bile. Some refused to return after the 2nd week. They said the mud breathed. One worker, Josiah, swore he uncovered a row of wooden stakes buried in the muck, each tipped with a rusted chain. Not anchors, not posts, but restraints. He said he found bones at their base, small, human, and scorched. When he brought one to the foreman, it crumbled to ash in his hand. On the 13th day, the water turned red. Not bright, but deep, like wine spilled into ink. The judge insisted it was silt, the runoff of iron veins in the soil. But when he reached into the water, he pulled out a strip of cloth, Eleanor's lace sleeve. The men dropped their tools and fled. That night, the judge stood alone at the drained basin, staring into the hollow that had once been the marsh. The land beneath shimmered under the lantern light, black, uneven breathing. Then came the smell. Not death, not decay, but blood heated by the sun. He thought he saw movement in the mud. A hand, a face, a voice that rasped his name. By dawn he ordered the marsh sealed again. He built a wall around it, stone high and wide. But the stench didn't leave Beaufort. The well water turned sour. The livestock refused to drink. And every night at midnight, the townsfolk said they could hear the judge's name whispered from the basin, softly at first, then louder, until the whole town seemed to echo with the voice of a man who had no tongue left to speak. The judge began to lose sleep, and with it his mind. By the end of that winter, Judge Tillinghast had become a ghost in his own home. His sons were gone, his wife missing, and the land itself seemed to pulse with a sickness that no sermon could cleanse. Yet Beaufort was built on appearances, and appearances demanded control. So one evening, beneath the cracked dome of the courthouse, 12 men gathered in silence. They were Beaufort's most powerful, the sheriff, the reverend, the physician, and the merchants whose fortunes fed the town's pride. They called it a civic meeting. It was nothing of the sort. The judge arrived last, his skin pale as tallow, his eyes rimmed with sleepless red. He brought with him a small box wrapped in burlap and tied with a black ribbon. When he set it on the table, the air seemed to shift, heavy, wet, almost metallic. He said nothing for a long while. Then finally, "Gentlemen, this town has been touched by something older than law." He unwrapped the box. Inside lay a handful of objects dredged from the drained marsh. A jawbone, a rusted chain link, a strip of human skin carved with symbols none could read. The reverend recoiled. The sheriff crossed himself, but the judge didn't flinch. He spoke of Ansel, not as a man, but as a vessel, a thing born under his jurisdiction, shaped by his hand, then released into something else. He said the marsh was a gate and the river its mouth, that when Ansel's blood was spilled upon that soil, something ancient had awakened, something that remembered being fed. The men wanted to burn the remains. The reverend suggested prayer. The judge forbade both. "You cannot destroy what remembers," he said. "You can only bargain." So they struck a pact. No law would record the disappearances. No sermon would speak of the marsh. Every man in that room swore silence upon pain of ruin. They sealed the box beneath the courthouse floor and called it done. But that night, each man woke to the same sound outside his home, a slow, dragging chain across the dirt. By dawn, the sheriff's hounds were found castrated, and the judge's gate was standing open. The courthouse in Beaufort was built on the bones of a Spanish fort, brick and lime laid over ruins that once held prisoners of war. But after the pact, its foundation became something else, a tomb. Beneath its floor, sealed in black earth, lay the judge's offering to silence. For a time it worked. The town returned to order. The markets reopened. Church bells rang again. But those who had attended the meeting began to wither, each in his own way. The reverend's sermons turned erratic. He spoke of rivers that drank memory, of God refusing to enter certain rooms. The sheriff took to drink, muttering that he heard something breathing in the jail at night, and the judge, he stopped attending court altogether. He claimed the courthouse had changed. He said the floor moved. The first sound came during a rainstorm, a hollow tapping beneath the wooden panels like knuckles against a coffin lid. Then came the dragging, slow, deliberate circling the room. He ordered the janitor to tear up the planks, but when they did, the earth below was dry and untouched. No tunnels, no rodents, nothing. Yet at night the noise returned, always under the judge's bench, always after midnight. The townsfolk began to notice him muttering during hearings, answering questions that hadn't been asked. His hand trembled when he wrote. He refused to walk across the courthouse floor unless the sheriff was present. One evening he arrived early and locked the doors behind him. The rain fell heavy, thunder rolling across the harbor. Witnesses later claimed the lamps inside flickered for hours, then went out entirely. When the doors were finally broken open the next morning, They found the judge sitting at his bench, silent, his robes soaked in mud. The floorboards beneath him were cracked open. The soil below churned as if something had clawed its way out. Carved into the underside of the judge's bench was a single sentence, written backward, as if from inside the earth. The law remembers its maker. The judge never spoke again. But that night the courthouse bell rang 13 times. No one touched it. Reverend Matthew Crowther had been the spiritual spine of Beaufort, stern, eloquent, and unbending. His voice once filled the pews like thunder through stained glass. But after the courthouse packed, something in him broke. His sermons lost their rhythm. His words turned brittle. The congregation said he no longer preached to them but through them, as though someone else were speaking behind his tongue. He began waking before dawn, wandering the church barefoot. The sexton would find him standing before the altar, eyes closed, whispering in an unfamiliar language. When asked what he was saying, the reverend would only reply, "I am answering." At first they thought it grief, the judge's misfortune weighing on him. But when the reverend's hands began to bleed during communion, people stopped coming to Mass. They said the wine turned black when he touched it. By spring, the walls of the chapel began to rot from the inside out. Plaster cracked like splitting bone, and a black ooze seeped between the boards. The smell was unbearable, metallic, thick and wet. When they scraped it away, they found scripture carved into the wood beneath. Not written, carved with fingernails. "Mercy has left this house." That same night, the reverend was found in his quarters clutching his Bible to his chest. The pages inside had fused together, soaked in something dark that wasn't blood. He was murmuring one phrase over and over: "He waits under water." The next Sunday, the church bell rang by itself. The sound was low, sickly, and seemed to vibrate inside the bones of anyone who heard it. The people of Beaufort began to whisper that the reverend had brought something back from the marsh, that he had been marked. When the judge came to see him, his first time in church since Eleanor's disappearance, the reverend didn't rise. He only smiled faintly and said, "You can drain the marsh, Silas, but you cannot drain a soul." The judge left without speaking. That night the reverend's heart burst inside his chest while he slept, though his eyes, when they found him, were still open. Still watching, and on the wall above his bed, someone had written with a trembling hand, "The river remembers." Long before the judge or his sons, before the courthouse or the church, the land around Beaufort had belonged to the river. The old one said its water was not meant for drinking but for binding. It carried memory like a vein carries blood. And on the night they came to call the Night of Chains, that memory rose to the surface again. It began just before midnight, when the moon burned red through the mist and every hound in Beaufort started howling in unison. The sound spread like fever through the fields. In the slave quarters on the outskirts of the Tillinghast estate, the women woke to find the air heavy with the smell of iron, sharp, wet, and alive. Then came the noise. A rattling, faint at first, then louder, chains dragging across dirt, crossing thresholds that hadn't been opened in years. The old midwife, Mama Jo, said she saw them before anyone else did. Hundreds of links moving through the fields with no bodies to pull them. The chains slithered like serpents toward the marsh, glowing faintly in the dark, as though lit from beneath the ground. Every lantern blew out at once, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound. Those who were awake swore they saw shapes standing at the edge of the fields, men without faces, their hands bound but their heads raised as if answering a call. One boy, too young to understand, followed them into the dark. He was never seen again. At dawn, the ground outside every cabin was marked, lines carved into the soil, forming a pattern like river veins. The elders recognized it. It was a sign once used on the coast of Dahomey, the mark of vengeance through return. Mama Jo told the others not to speak of it, but the message spread like a curse. Ansel has called the forgotten home. That morning, the river turned still, and not a ripple, not a sound. The people of Beaufort said the water had begun listening, and from that day forward no chain in the county would hold its shape. They rusted, broke, or simply vanished by dawn, as if the iron itself had remembered what it once was, a weapon made from suffering. The morning after the night of chains, the tide fell lower than any living soul in Beaufort could remember. The river withdrew from its banks like a creature recoiling from its own reflection. The mud flats stretched for miles and black, glistening, breathing. Children wandered to the docks to watch, but their laughter died when they saw what the water left behind. At first, it looked like driftwood, long pale forms tangled in reeds. Then the smell reached them, something between rust and rot thick enough to taste. When the sheriff arrived, he found 5 shapes lying side by side in the shallows. They were dressed in fine clothes that no longer fit human skin. It was the Tillinghast sons, or what was left of them. Their faces were gone, flayed clean, their mouths sewn shut with twine. Each had a symbol carved deep into his chest. 2 interlocking circles crossed downward, the same mark from Eleanor's hymnal. Their hands were folded, fingers bound together with wire. But there was something worse. Their bodies were dry. No blood, no moisture, as if they'd been drained and preserved, waiting to be found. When the doctor cut one open, river silt spilled from the wound like ash. In the eldest son's mouth they found a piece of parchment still legible despite the damp. It read, "The sons are returned. The father remains." The judge collapsed when he saw them. He demanded the sheriff burn the bodies, but the reverend's replacement refused burial rites. The townsfolk whispered that the sons had been offered, that their deaths were not punishment but payment. The corpses were sealed in pine boxes and buried behind the courthouse wall, not consecrated ground, but convenient. Yet 3 nights later, when the watchmen made their rounds, they found the graves unearthed. The coffins were empty. The earth beneath them pulsed with water, dark and slow-moving, as though the river itself had crept back underground to reclaim what was its own. From that night on, the people of Beaufort swore they could hear voices echoing through the tide, a chorus of men humming in perfect rhythm, the same hymn Ansel once sang while mending fences. By summer of 1849, the judge was no longer the man Beaufort remembered. His hair, once black as tar, had turned bone white. His skin hung loose, translucent. He avoided mirrors, windows, even puddles after the rain. He told his servants to cover the looking glasses in his home with cloth. "There are things," he said, "that look back too closely." The judge had taken to sleeping in his study, pistol by his hand. The house had grown restless, doors opening on their own, the walls sweating with damp. The servants claimed they heard 2 voices coming from his chamber at night, one pleading, one whispering, and every dawn, the judge was found with fresh mud beneath his nails. On the 7th night after the bodies of his sons vanished from their graves, the judge awoke to the sound of running water. He followed it down the hall to the parlor. There the grand mirror, the only one left uncovered, was fogged with condensation as though it were breathing. He stared. At first he saw only his reflection, gaunt, trembling. Then it smiled. The judge hadn't moved. But the reflection did. It spoke with his voice calm and deliberate. "You buried them in law, Silas, but law was born of blood." The judge raised his pistol and fired. The mirror shattered, splintering the air with a sound like a scream. But where the glass had been, water poured from the frame, pooling across the floor. The smell of the marsh filled the room, thick, fetid, alive. He stumbled back, dropping the pistol. In the rippling water his reflection reformed, not as himself, but as something bloated, skinless, with a rope still biting into its neck. Its mouth moved, but the voice came from behind him. "I remember the river," it said. "Do you?" The judge fell to his knees. He could feel the floorboards pulse under his palms like a heartbeat. The voice grew louder, until the entire room seemed to hum with it. Low, vibrating, human and not. When the servants broke down the door at dawn, They found him kneeling before the empty frame, whispering to what wasn't there. The floor was dry. The pistol lay rusted and carved into the wall beside him. In small, deliberate letters, "The judge is learning to listen." By late autumn, the Tillinghast estate had become a haunted carcass of its former grandeur. The fields were barren, the fences collapsed, and moss grew over the judge's own nameplate. The few remaining servants had fled inland, leaving only 2 caretakers, both old, both nearly blind. They were the ones who found the well. It stood behind the slave quarters, hidden beneath a tangle of ivy and rotted boards. They called it the Widow's Well, though neither could recall where the name came from. The stones around its rim were smooth, too perfect for local craft, and carved with faint markings that looked like veins or roots. When the old man dropped a pebble inside, no splash came back, only a hollow breath, deep and wet, as if the earth itself were sighing. Word reached town quickly. The sheriff came first, then the new reverend, and finally the judge himself, trembling and gaunt, drawn to it like a moth to a candle. He claimed the well had never existed before, that the land behind the quarters had been level for decades. But when they cleared the brush, they found a path of stones leading straight from the house to the rim, half sunken and blackened with old blood. The reverend leaned over the edge to inspect the depth. He dropped a lantern. It fell, flickering until it disappeared completely, but the sound that came back wasn't the splash of water. It was a hum. Low, rhythmic, almost human. The same tune that had haunted Beaufort for months. Ansel's song. The judge stumbled back, clutching his chest. He swore he saw movement inside. A face looking up, not from below, but from the walls, as if the stones themselves had eyes. He screamed for the men to cover it, to bury it again. But before they could, a noise rose from the well. The sound of chains dragging through water, slow and deliberate. Then a voice rasping, soaked in centuries of mud. "Silas." The judge collapsed. The others fled. The well was sealed again under stone and soil, but the sound did not stop. That night the river overflowed its banks, though there had been no rain. And every window in Beaufort rattled with the rhythm of that hum, the hymn of a man who'd once been denied his own name. By the spring of 1850, Beaufort had grown quiet. Too quiet. The judge no longer left his estate. The townsmen walked with their heads down. The church bell hadn't rung in months. It was as though the entire town had agreed without words to stop remembering. But memory has its own ways of surviving. It began with the children. One morning, the schoolteacher, Miss Turner, noticed strange drawings appearing on the slates, circles within circles, crossed downward, carved deep enough to scrape the wood. None of the children claimed to have made them. Yet by the end of the week, every desk bore the same mark. Then came the humming. During lessons, a low, steady sound began rising from the back rows. The older boys said they could hear it even when no one's lips were moving. It was always the same rhythm, slow, river-like. The same hymn Ansel once sang while working the fields. By the second month, several children had begun waking in the night, soaked in sweat, claiming they had dreamed of the deep hole with the whispering stones. Parents dismissed it as childish fright. Until one morning, the youngest boy in town was found sleepwalking in his nightshirt, standing barefoot in the marsh. His feet were covered in black silt. His eyes were open, but he didn't see. When they brought him home, he whispered a single phrase over and over. "The man in the water says my name." Soon after, more children began sleepwalking. They gathered by the riverbanks before dawn, silent, staring toward the water as if listening for something. Their parents began locking doors, shuttering windows. Still the humming persisted, through walls, through dreams, through the pulse of the tide itself. The Reverend declared it mass hysteria. But old Mama Joe said it wasn't madness. It was memory looking for blood that hadn't yet been spilled. By summer, the children of Beaufort had stopped speaking altogether. They only hummed. And one night their voices joined in perfect unison, hundreds of small, steady tones that echoed across the town and into the marsh. The next morning, every crucifix in Beaufort was found turned upside down, not by hand, but by rust. By midsummer, Beaufort had become a town that whispered. No one lingered after sunset. The markets closed before dusk, and the reverend's sermons grew shorter, tighter, almost desperate. The humming had spread, from the children to the adults, from dreams into waking hours. The sound was faint at first, like bees trapped beneath the floorboards, but it grew clearer by the day, until it seemed to come from the very walls of the church itself. The reverend tried to drown it out with the bell. He rang at morning, noon, and dusk, an iron cry over the rooftops. But each time the bell tolled, the humming grew louder, matching its rhythm exactly, note for note. Then one night the bell rang on its own. The sound woke the entire town. The air was thick, unmoving. When the reverend and a few men entered the church tower, they found the bell swaying gently, though no wind touched it. And hanging from its clapper was something slick and dark. Not rope, not cloth, but hair. Human hair. They tried to cut it free, but as soon as they touched the strands, the metal began to vibrate. A sound rolled through the tower. Low, mournful, almost like breathing. The bell trembled, then split clean down the middle with a noise like thunder. The men fled, but the reverend stayed. He stared into the hollow shape where the bell had been and saw something carved into the metal's inner curve. Remember the river. The next morning, the church doors were found open. The reverend's robes lay folded at the altar, soaked through with something black and metallic smelling. His shoes stood beside them, empty. From that day forward, no bell ever rang in Beaufort again. The tower stood silent, its cracked shell swaying slightly in the wind. But sometimes, when the air was heavy and the tide was high, people swore they could hear the faintest ring echoing from the marshes, as if the bell were tolling underwater. And beneath that tone, almost lost in its depths, was a whisper, the name of the man the town had tried to forget. Autumn came to Beaufort like a bruise, swollen skies, the color of old blood pressing low over the marshes. The river had turned dark, thicker somehow, its current sluggish and heavy. Fishermen swore their nets came up tangled with hair and pale scraps of cloth. The air smelled of iron and rot, even when the wind blew inland. By then the town's patience had rotted into superstition. They blamed the well, the marsh, the judge's land, anything but themselves. A meeting was called beneath the oak behind the courthouse. The judge, pale and trembling, sat hunched in his chair, his cane rattling against the roots. The sheriff proposed a cleansing. Fire, salt, scripture. They would burn the quarters, seal the fields, and pray until dawn. That night they gathered in a procession. Torches flickered against the Spanish moss, painting the faces of men who had not slept in weeks. They poured salt in a circle around the property, chanting psalms that faltered halfway through. Then one by one they set the old buildings alight. The fire spread quickly, too quickly. The wind turned without warning, driving the smoke back toward the town. The air filled with screams, but it wasn't the sound of burning wood. It was something deeper, the sound of voices that had been waiting beneath the earth. From the river came a roar, not of water, but of release. The surface broke open like skin and something began to rise. The men dropped their torches. The judge fell to his knees, clawing at his chest, gasping the same words again and again. He's taking it back. He's taking it all back. By dawn, the fires had died. The river was calm again, the air thick with the smell of smoke and rust. But every man who'd taken part in the burning bore the same mark across his palms and thin, circular scars like rings of ash pressed into flesh. The judge was found kneeling at the riverbank, eyes open, mouth full of mud. Beside him, the sheriff's torch still smoldered, though no flame remained, and beneath the surface, faintly visible in the morning light, the river shimmered, not silver, but red. It was said that if you stood by the shore long enough, you could still hear it whispering over and over, in a voice both tender and terrible. A debt paid is never a debt forgotten. The journal was found years later, sealed in a tin box beneath the floorboards of the Tillinghast estate. The pages were brittle, the ink brown with age, but the handwriting was steady, precise, even graceful. On the first page, written in a careful, deliberate hand, were 5 words. To whoever finds this, listen. Clara Tillinghast had not spoken in public since the fire. She had withdrawn entirely from Beaufort, refusing visitors, living alone in the house that had once echoed with laughter, music, and the scrape of boots on polished wood. Her servants fled one by one until none remained. Yet she wrote every night by candlelight. The words became her only companion, her own exorcism. She described the well, the humming, the children, the bell. But most of all, she wrote of her husband. She wrote how the judge had not merely punished Ansel, he had used him. How he had believed that power could be drawn from the suffering of another man, that to take away a man's body was to steal his spirit. It was the Reverend, she said, who first told him of the ritual, an old heresy whispered through the plantations, that if a man of pure law shed the blood of his servant upon consecrated land, he could bind that man's will forever. But the judge had gone further. He had taken more than blood. He had taken lineage. The journal's later entries grew disjointed, smeared by tears or shaking hands. She claimed the judge's sons had begun to change before their deaths, that their reflections in mirrors did not match their faces, that they spoke in voices that were not their own. On the final page, the writing turned into a confession. I hear him still, in the walls, in the river, in the space between sleep and waking. My husband thought he enslaved a man, but it was our souls he bartered away. The land is his now, all of it. Beneath her signature was a single dried fingerprint, pressed in the shape of a ring. The journal ended there. But on the back cover, faintly visible under candle scorch, was a final phrase, carved rather than written. He remembers the well. In the winter of 1851, Beaufort's last candle burned inside the Tillinghast estate. The town had emptied by then, fields overgrown, shutters nailed, doors rotting in their frames. But from the big house, faint light flickered through the cracks as if someone still kept vigil for the dead. That someone was Clara. She hadn't stepped outside in months. The servants were gone, the furniture covered in sheets, the mirrors draped in black cloth. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock, steady, deliberate, like a heartbeat that refused to die. She ate in silence, setting 6 plates every night. 1 for herself, 5 for her sons, and 1 for her husband at the head of the table. She placed their silverware with trembling care, whispering their names as she did, like a prayer or an apology. On the final night, the wind was still. Even the crickets refused to sing. She prepared the meal as always, stew, cornbread, and a bottle of the judge's wine, dusty and unopened since the fire. She poured 6 glasses. The air grew heavy, and then the clock stopped. At first she thought it was the silence that frightened her, but then she heard it, faint at first beneath the floorboard, that low river-like hum. The sound rose until the dishes trembled and the walls quivered with it. One by one, the chairs at the table began to move. Not violently, but slowly scraping across the floor as if taking their places. Clara froze. The candles flickered, dimming to a dull orange glow. In the glass of the wine she saw movement, ripples like something breathing beneath the surface. Then a shape began to form across the table, the faint outline of a man's face, eyes open, lips unmoving. She whispered, "Ansel." The hum stopped. The silence that followed was worse, total, deafening. Then the house exhaled. The windows shattered inward. The clock began ticking backward. The candle flames turned blue. When the neighbors came at dawn, they found the dining room door sealed from the inside. Clara sat at the head of the table, her body upright, her eyes fixed forward, as if still hosting supper. The 6 plates were empty, but each glass was filled to the brim with river water, and from the rim of her own cup, a single drop of blood hung suspended, as if waiting to fall. By the spring of 1852, Beaufort was no longer a town. It was a hollowed memory. A place people mentioned only in hushed tones, as if saying its name might wake something. Yet the earth never forgot. The marshes had begun to rise. Slowly, inch by inch, the river crept back over the fields. It swallowed fences first, then roads, then the graveyard behind the church. The headstones tilted like teeth rotting out of a jaw. No one stayed long enough to bury the new dead. They left them where they fell, and the river took them all the same. Travelers passing through spoke of strange sounds at night. A low, pulsing hum that made the air vibrate, like a heart beating beneath the soil. Others swore they saw lights moving beneath the water, not reflections, but figures walking slowly just below the surface, faces pale, eyes open. One fisherman, the last to leave, claimed that when he cast his line, it caught not on rock but on bone. When he pulled it free, a human tooth clung to the hook. He dropped his gear and fled, never to return. By midsummer, the Tillinghast estate was half submerged. Its roof jutted from the water like the spine of a drowning beast. The oak behind the courthouse stood half drowned too, its roots tangled in silt and bones. The bell tower leaned toward the river, its split metal glinting like a scar. Locals in nearby towns said the water never stilled there. Even when the wind was calm, ripples moved outward from the center, as if something beneath was breathing, remembering. Children born in the surrounding counties were warned never to swim near Beaufort's edge. They called it the river that waits. On rare nights when the moon was full, the surface glowed red, not from reflection, but from something glowing underneath. Those who dared to look too long claimed to see faces forming there, not monstrous, just human, silent, sorrowful, and endless, and if you listened close enough, past the rustle of reeds and the hum of insects, you could still hear it, as in that same slow hymn rising and falling with the tide, sung by voices that had learned patience over pain. The river had not forgotten its debt. Now it was collecting its interest. 80 years later, in the summer of 1932, the name Beaufort had nearly vanished from maps. A few swampy acres marked its ghost, labeled simply as floodplain number 7. But in the Charleston Historical Society, a young archivist named Edward Keene found it again, not on a map, but in a forgotten box marked Judicial Records, 1840-1850. Inside were ruined ledgers, half-burned deeds, and a waterlogged Bible bound in black leather. On its inner cover, written in faded ink, was a single name, Silas Tillinghast. Edward wasn't a superstitious man. He had trained under rationalists, skeptics, men who believed every ghost was a symptom of poor record-keeping. But there was something about the pages that unsettled him. The ink had bled into the parchment like veins. Some words seemed to shift when he looked away. He spent nights alone in the archive, tracing the Tillinghast lineage, piecing together court documents that no one had catalogued. The deeper he read, the stranger it became. Court transcripts described a series of disappearances in 1848, a judge and his 5 sons, consumed by accident and divine reproof. The sheriff's signature was smeared by what appeared to be dried rust. Then, he found a letter, unsigned, dated months after the incident. The river rises in sleep. The bell no longer rings. We cannot bury what was not born. The handwriting was faintly elegant, a woman's. That night Edward dreamt of water. He heard chains dragging across the floor of the archive, though he knew he was alone. When he awoke, the Bible lay open beside him, though he was certain he'd locked it away. The page was blank except for a single damp fingerprint. Over the next week, the humidity in the archive grew unbearable. The papers stuck together. Mold crept over the boxes, and then came the smell, copper and silt. When his supervisor found him 3 days later, Edward was sitting motionless at his desk, staring at the wall. The Bible was gone. His notes were soaked through, as if they'd been submerged. On the table before him, carved neatly into the wood, were 3 words: "He still listens." In 1950, nearly a century after the Tillinghast tragedy, a sound engineer named Margaret Halloway arrived in Charleston to archive old wax cylinders. Among the collection was a box marked Beaufort, 1848. Miscellaneous recordings. The box was water damaged, the labels almost illegible. She set one cylinder on the player. Static hissed first. Then slowly a low hum filled the room. It was faint, river-like, vibrating the walls. Margaret leaned closer. Words emerged, whispered but clear. Silas, you cannot hide what flows beneath. The voice was not the judge's nor Ansel's, yet it carried the weight of both. It rose and fell with a rhythm like a tide. Behind it another layer of sound. Chains dragging, a bell tolling underwater, children humming a hymn long forgotten. Margaret's hands shook. She rewound the cylinder, played it again. The voice repeated the same phrase. And then came a final line, chilling in its simplicity. The river remembers. The river takes. The river waits. The engineer left the cylinder on the table and stepped outside. The Charleston air was crisp, but her ears still caught the faint hum, as if the room itself had absorbed the river's song. She returned hours later and the cylinder was gone. No wax, no box, no record. Only the hum remained faintly beneath the hum of the city. Over the following weeks, anyone who had entered the archive reported hearing the river at night. Sometimes it whispered names, Silas, Ansel, Clara. Sometimes it sang the same hymn the children of Beaufort once hummed before dawn. The river had returned. Not as water or marsh, not as corpse or bell, but as a voice, patient, eternal, waiting in memory, echoing through wood and paper, reaching anyone who might dare to remember. And so the town of Beaufort, though erased from maps, lives still, in whispers, in rivers, in the heartbeat of the earth. Because some debts are not paid by fire, flood, or time. They are carried, always,